Connected by purpose, driven by passion. This is Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series.
Children's Healthcare Canada would like to thank the following Keystone funding partners for their ongoing contributions that support all of our programs and activities: the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation, BC Children's Hospital Foundation, the Children's Hospital at London Health Sciences Centre, the Alberta Children's Hospital Foundation, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, and Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. We would also like to thank the organizations that provide funding for our knowledge translation activities, which includes this Spark Live webinar series, the Spark Conversations blog, and the Knowledge Exchange Network. To learn more about Children's Healthcare Canada, you can go to our website, follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or you can sign up for our weekly Spark newsletter at childrenshealthcarecanada.ca/email, where you will learn about upcoming events, read the latest posts from our blog, and other exciting news and events from across the child and youth healthcare community. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series. I'm Doug Maynard, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And Spark Live is where we gather each Wednesday to curate, convene, and showcase excellence and innovation from across the child and youth healthcare community and learn about news and events and other exciting things that are happening across our community with the goal to spark conversation, spark ideas and action. And since we are live for these sessions, I do want to remind everyone that you do have the opportunity to type questions into the question box at any time. And we will check for questions at various points throughout the session potentially. So don't wait until we call for questions. Just type those questions in as you think of them. And also feel free to share your thoughts on Twitter and be sure to tag us at Child Health Can. All right, and today we're going to be talking about medical assistance and dying and mature minors. Where are we now? In medical assistance and dying is sometimes referred to as MAiD. You might hear it referred to as MAiD, M-A-I-D. And the conversation today is not going to be a discussion for or against medical assistance in dying. This is because it's already a reality in Canadian legislation. What we're talking about here is the next phase of this legislation and where the federal government is with respect to discussions around including mature minors within the existing legislation. And really the focus today is going to be just to give us a sense of where those conversations are and what healthcare institutions might need to be aware of in the interim as we go through this process. So it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Don Davies. Dr. Davies was the medical director of the pediatric palliative care program at University of Alberta in Edmonton for about 20 years. And recently, not even a year ago, joined us here in Ottawa at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario and is now leading their palliative care program. And she's also over at the Roger Neilson House in Ottawa as well, which is a palliative care hospice for children in Ottawa here. Dr. Davies received her master's in healthcare ethics and law from the University of Manchester, and she's also the chair of the bioethics committee of the Canadian Pediatric Society. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to hand the virtual podium over to Dr. Don Davies.
Thanks very much, Doug. Just one minor correction. I'm not the medical director in CHEO. Dr. Vadaboncourt is. But so I know we have a lot of ground to cover. I just wanted to point out that I don't have any disclosures to make. And I'm hoping by the end of the conversation that you'll understand some of the key milestones that led us to where we are now as far as medical assistance and dying goes in Canada. And also to describe the legal concept of a mature minor and how mature minors are currently involved in their healthcare decisions. And then a little bit about the ethical debate surrounding the possible inclusion or the continued exclusion of mature minors from MAiD in Canada. So I just wanted to mention a little bit about what a mature minor is. So this is a feature of Canadian law, except in Quebec, and I'll come to that later. Basically, we're talking about a person who is under the age of majority, so not an adult, and in most of Canada, it's 18 or 19 years old, who has the capacity to understand and appreciate the nature and consequences of a decision. If a minor is deemed mature, they can make healthcare decisions without their parents' consent. That's an important feature of the law. And really, it evolved from healthcare decisions regarding one's reproductive health as decisions being independent from one's parents. Minors currently are involved in their health discussions and decisions proportionate to their evolving maturity. And there is usually agreement between healthcare teams, minor patients, and their parents. And I think it's important to point out that very few situations actually go to a court of law, and that's really a forum of last resort. So a quick review of the timeline. In June 2014, Quebec actually led the rest of Canada with an act respecting end-of-life care. And then shortly after, in February of 2015, the Carter versus Canada decision came down from the Supreme Court, and basically legislators and regulatory bodies were given 1 year to respond to this change in the criminal code. In December 2015, Quebec's MAiD provisions were actually put into force, and so that was ahead of the federal legislation. Then in January of 2016, a 4-month extension was granted so that MAiD finally became possible in Canada in June of 2016 through the form of Bill C-14, and that is our federal MAiD law. So in a nutshell, what the Carter versus Canada case said is that it declared certain sections of the criminal code to be invalid, and those were the sections which prohibited a physician's assistance with terminating life. And the reason they stated was that this prohibition was actually an infringement upon a person's right to life, liberty, and security of the person for those who wanted to seek a physician-assisted death. A quick note about Quebec. So their Bill 52, an act respecting end-of-life care, as mentioned, started in the Quebec National Assembly in 2009 and was passed into law and into effect in 2015. It differs a little bit from the Carter decision in that it considers terminal illnesses only, and I'll come to those differences in a moment. Also important, despite consent for most medical treatments in Quebec to be at 14 years of age, and I'm not going to go into sort of the features of that, their medical assistance in dying is prohibited under the age of 18 years. And also importantly, Quebec has no notion in its civil code of law of a mature minor. So that is an important difference. Also importantly, in Bill 52, there is a recognition of the explicit right to receive end-of-life care, different from the rest of Canada. And it also enshrines in law palliative sedation as an option at end of life. Certainly across Canada, palliative sedation is an option, but it isn't formalized in the way that it is in Quebec. And very important that these two features are applicable to minors as well as adults. So then how did mature minors come into the whole discussion? The first mention of this in Canada was during the Provincial Territorial Expert Advisory Group on Physician-Assisted Dying. And it pertains to pediatrics when they state that physician-assisted death should not be impeded by the imposition of arbitrary age limits, and that changes to the criminal code should be based on competence rather than age. So that was the first time this was mentioned. The context of this, though, is in the Greater Carter decision. And so unlike Quebec, where only terminal illnesses are considered, the Carter decision actually said that extension might be not to those just who are dying, but those with other grievous and irremediable medical conditions, which I know is quite vague, but that is the language of the law, and that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual. And this suffering can either be psychological or physical. So this opened the door then that the question of could an intractable mental illness or mental disorder that the person feels causes intolerable disability actually be eligible for MAiD? And that was one of the other things that was considered by the expert panels I will mention. And the reason I think that mature minors were excluded in the first iteration after a lot of debate was one of the substantive criteria in the Carter decision was that the person was a competent adult. The context of the Canadian law is also a little bit different in that in many other jurisdictions, the focus has really been on personal autonomy as the overarching principle. But the Carter decision was based a lot more in a human rights framework, and there was, I would say, as much emphasis on suffering as there was on autonomy. And for that reason, I think that it's possible that parents might challenge the courts on the basis that their suffering child is being discriminated against on the basis of age. And again, we'll talk about this during the question period. In a nutshell, though, so who is currently eligible for MAiD in Canada is it has to be a person that's eligible for healthcare services in that province, and this is to preclude medical tourism for people coming from other countries or other provinces. The person must be 18 years and capable of making their healthcare decision. They must have, as previously stated, a grievous and irremediable medical condition. I won't go into all the other features, but the key point currently is that a natural death needs to be reasonably foreseeable. And I know this is all very legal language. It's not the language of pediatrics, but this is the language of the law. So this is sort of what we're working with at this stage of the conversation. Another key feature of the law is that the request must be voluntary from the person who is seeking MAiD, and they must be able to give informed consent. Just a side note, I think in Canada there's a lot of belief that MAiD can only be provided by administration of medications by a practitioner. In Canada, that's either a physician or a nurse practitioner. But just to point out that self-administration by the patient is allowable by that law, but just that very few patients actually opt for that. So what can we learn from international cases concerning minors? The only countries that allow medical assistance in dying for minors is Belgium and Netherlands, and recently Colombia. And I think it's important to consider in the context of all the other jurisdictions around the world that do allow MAiD or some form of assisted dying for adults, but that do exclude children. So it's very rare. In Belgium, they've only reported 3 cases since it was allowable for minors since 2014. And as you'll notice on the left side of your screen, that little chart showing the 3 patients, 2 of them were actually very young, the age of 9 and 11. In Netherlands, mature minors have been eligible for assistance in dying since 2002. So far, there have only been 13 cases, and as you can see, it's only 0.02% of all those that have received some assistance in dying in Netherlands. And looking at the chart on your right-hand side, you'll see that they are all children that have had terminal illnesses, and for the most part, they are older teens, with the exception of a 12 and a 14-year-old. The new development is in Colombia, and I think Colombia is important to discuss because it's the only other jurisdiction where MAiD actually arose from a court decision, as did the Carter decision in Canada. All other jurisdictions, the law has changed largely because of societal discussion and debate. And so Colombia has actually modeled its law similarly to Canada. And up until recently, it had precluded minors, but the courts were petitioned by parents of a dying minor. And the court actually agreed with this minor's ability to seek medical assistance in dying. In their law that has evolved from this case, children as young as 6 to 12 can be considered, which is much younger than what's being considered in other jurisdictions, and they must be evaluated by a psychologist or a psychiatrist who concludes that they do understand the choice. And importantly, the parents must consent. Similarly, children ages 12 to 14 can request the procedure with their parents' consent, but children older than 14 can actually request an assisted death even if their parents are not in agreement. It's interesting because Colombia identifies as a very Catholic country with about 80% of its population purporting to be of the Roman Catholic faith, and that and evangelical churches are very strong in Colombia, and both of those churches have spoken very firmly against medical assistance in dying. And so to this point, there are no cases in the public system of a minor actually receiving medical assistance. The child that I mentioned actually lost capacity to consent and so died without assistance as far as we know. But because there's also a private system in Colombia, it is supposed that some parents and minors potentially mature but maybe otherwise are seeking medical assistance and dying outside of the system for purposes of concealment. So when the whole Carter decision came down, through my work with the Canadian Pediatric Society on the Bioethics Committee, we really considered that this likely was going to touch the mature minor population because all of healthcare does have that notion currently. So what we did is, in an effort to make a position statement, we soon recognized that we actually had no information, no evidence. And so we did a survey of the Canadian Pediatric Surveillance Program. We had to keep the answers sort of knowledge or service-based, not opinion research, as per the Public Health Agency of Canada, who is the CPS partner in this research. And I actually wanted to consider all minors, given anecdotal experiences that I have had as a palliative care physician, but also, that I've heard from many of my colleagues, and also because of the Dutch experience. And just to touch on this briefly, Netherlands is a little bit different in that in the mid-2000s, the New England Journal of Medicine reported an article called the Groningen Protocol. And this was sort of just reporting what was informally being done in Netherlands, which was that newborns said to have a sort of a grievous and irremediable condition with, quote, intolerable suffering could actually be euthanized. That is the language of that article, and I presume that's because a newborn can't give consent, and so therefore they're not asking for voluntary assistance. It is euthanasia. And the somewhat disturbing factor in that report was all the 22 babies reported had spina bifida, which, some would predict a degree of future suffering for the child and the family, but certainly not in the newborn period. So just enough to say that that sort of precedent was out there in the literature. And so for that reason, we wanted to consider all minors. So the question to answer was, how often are Canadian pediatricians engaging in exploratory conversations or receiving explicit requests for MAiD, either from youth or from their parents? And I want to point out that the legislation that's being contemplated in Canada and around the world is really about mature minors being eligible. There's nowhere that is considering assistance in dying for a young person that has never been capable of making their own health care decisions. So the law is clear that no person, including a parent, can make a request for MAiD on behalf of any other person. And, but as mentioned, we considered minors in this survey because we are definitely having conversations with parents. So when we did this survey in, that would have been June of 2016, we had almost 2,600 responses, 1050 responded to 2,600 that went out, so only a 40% response rate. But as you'll recognize for healthcare provider surveys, that's actually not a bad result. And it was actually apparently at the time the highest response rate for a one-time survey for CPSP CP. The discussions and requests for MAiD varied roughly proportional to the population of Canada's geography, and general pediatricians were, sorry, my little screen here is blocking it, but I think about 60% of the respondent group. So as you'll see here, the participants are the responders to the survey on the x-axis, and you can see this is now talking about conversations with youth themselves and practitioners. So 35 respondents reported having 60 conversations about medical assistance in dying with youth, but 9 participants responded actually having explicit requests from about 16 young patients. All of these were 14 years of age or older and had some combination of terminal illness, intractable suffering, or severe disability. And the discussions and explicit requests from parents, as you'll see, is a much larger group. So 118 participants reported having conversations about hastening death of their child with 419 different parents. And 45 participants reported having an explicit request for MAiD from 91 parents. And then we wanted to do a second survey about what do healthcare providers actually think about medical assistance in dying for minors. And we did this just through the Canadian Pediatrics Society. You'll see that the response rate was much lower. So we only had 487 responses, mostly in English, mostly from female respondents, and half of which were general pediatricians. Interestingly, the largest subspecialty group that responded to the survey was neonatologists. And that's important because for the slides that I just presented about parental conversations and parental explicit requests, half of those were for infants under 1 year of age. So there is that correlation with neonatology there. In this survey, almost 60% reported being routinely involved in the end-of-life care of children. And in terms of what they thought, about 46% thought that mature minors should be able to request and be eligible for MAiD, whereas about a third of our respondents said no, not under any circumstances. And then looking at should parents be able to make a request for MAiD for their never competent child, 32% thought yes and 43% felt no. And I must say that almost a third of our respondents feeling that parents should be able to make that request surprised me, especially in view of the law that specifically precludes that. So just before I move on to what has then subsequently happened with the independent reviews that were required by Bill C-14 itself, just being sort of within the last 15 minutes of the presentation, I'll ask if there's any sort of burning questions to this point.
So no, there have not been any questions come in, but that's just my chance to remind the audience to type those questions in as you think of them. Then we'll have them ready in case Dr. Davies pauses again for any questions. Okay, so what happened in Bill C-14 at the end of the law itself in the preamble, it talked about 3 potentially vulnerable groups, and so mature minors were one of them. The other was those with mental disorders as the sole underlying reason for the request for medical assistance in dying. And the third was advance requests. So that could be as distant as making a request for medical assistance in dying before you've even been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. Or it could be as soon as someone who is, for example, suffering from cancer, is on a lot of pain medications and wants to make an advance request in case of their status becoming incapable to make a decision right at the time that they wanted to receive MAiD. So those are the three vulnerable groups that were required to be independently reviewed. And so that review went to the Council of Canadian Academies. The Council of Canadian Academies, I'm not going to go into the details, but their job, it's a nonpartisan
sort of group that gets expert panels sort of combined on any kind of scientific question. And the goal is really to gather knowledge and evidence on that question. And that's the level of the exercise. So what we were specifically not asked to do was to do public consultations to make any sort of recommendations or advocate a position. We were not to evaluate the current law, and we weren't to evaluate or take positions on pending legal challenges. So just looking at the upshots of that report, which was tabled before Parliament in December of 2018, why would we exclude a mature minor from accessing MAiD when mature minors already make end-of-life decisions, such as withholding and withdrawing treatment, just as an example? I'm going to come into some of the nuts and bolts of that in the next slide. And also, it was evident that children and adolescents do not experience physical pain differently than adults, and the degree of psychological suffering might be different, but certainly is still present in children and youth who have life-threatening and terminal illnesses. However, minors are perceived as vulnerable for a number of reasons and require protection. And so really, it at the end of the day is a trying to balance the exploitation and possible harm that could come from somebody that isn't truly capable of making the decision, but we make an error in that assessment and that person goes on to prematurely end their life. But on the other hand, we need to make sure that we're not unfairly and unethically restricting a capable person who has a grievous and irremediable healthcare problem and might wish to seek medical assistance in dying. So the key safeguard of obtaining informed consent also faces a number of challenges and ambiguity for mature minors. And I would say that one of the key challenges in day-to-day practice is the idea of voluntariness. And certainly for the court cases that have come before us where a minor is considering foregoing life-sustaining treatment, this becomes the really critical question a lot of the time is, has that person developed sufficiently from their family of origin to truly hold their own beliefs, and have they had enough life experience to actually make such a decision? So what do the courts consider? There are relevant legal cases of minors refusing potentially life-saving treatment. I think the ones that get the most media attention are the ones where there is a substantial likelihood of the child being able to be cured. But there also have been cases before the courts of children with terminal illnesses, and it's important to know that some of those children and youth have been able to make their own healthcare decision. They mostly have involved youth with advanced cancer who do not want further treatment. But what the courts look at is a complex interplay among the gravity of the decision. So definitely life and death decisions require a lot more scrutiny. What the minor's prognosis is matters critically, because if the patient is perceived to have a long life ahead of them, that's a very different scenario than the young person that only has a number of months or weeks to live no matter what is undertaken. Also critical is the minor's ability to understand and appreciate, what we're talking about, the information. And I think critical to this is what information has been received and who's delivering the information and with what potential biases. And lastly, are there any provincial or territorial healthcare consent or child welfare legislation that might apply? And as you know, that varies widely across Canada. But in a nutshell, prior to 2009, courts would generally side with, the parents and with the idea of sort of the doctrine of parens patriae, where we're going to do what's good for the child over and above their sort of, not wanting to go along with whatever is being prescribed, so over their objections. But an important case happened in 2009. This was AC versus Manitoba. And this was a situation where it was decided that even if the child might lose their life as a consequence of the decision, a minor must be assessed with the utmost scrutiny, and where it will have grave consequences, the minor should actually be able to decide. Usually that's the end of the story in most presentations, but it's interesting what actually played out in that case. And even though they presumed that the minor might be mature, the justices decided that autonomy was not the only sort of principle to be evaluated here, and that there were other things at play, such as the child's best interest. And so in this case, even though this was stated, and even though it's a pivotal case, the child or minor herself was actually overruled and did need to have court-ordered treatment. So could a minor ever provide informed consent for medical assistance in dying? And we know that the capacity to make end-of-life decisions is possessed by some minors and not others. And the one clear piece of evidence that came to light is that it really can't be predicated on chronological age alone, and that there needs to be case-by-case consideration of the child's cognitive and psychosocial development. But I think especially relevant is their social and cultural environment. So how long have they been living with this illness? What is their understanding, and how much a part of their healthcare decisions have they been a party to through their entire treatment trajectory? And lastly, that's also very important, is where did they get their support, and how are their relationships with their family and their healthcare team, their peers, and their siblings, as examples. So what the expert panel felt at the end of this kind of lengthy process that played out over about 18 months was that the potential positive impacts of allowing medical assistance in dying for mature minors might be an increased range of end-of-life choices and a feeling of control over death for minors that were eligible in a similar way to what we know adults are currently reporting. And I think that there's a feature of control even for people that don't go on to choose MAiD, just to know that it is an option for them. It might also be a source of relief for family members and practitioners who know that the mature minor can end their suffering if they wanted to do so. And it may create more open dialogue about end-of-life care in general among healthcare practitioners, patients, and their families. And there may be sort of an offshoot as well of having an increased focus on pediatric palliative care, so more awareness and potentially even more resources for palliative care. But on the flip side, and looking at the negative impacts of allowing extension of eligibility to mature minors, there was concern that some might feel sort of a pressure to request medical assistance in dying, particularly for youth with added vulnerabilities of any sort, recognizing that vulnerability is largely a social construct. But what we considered is children with or youth with significant disabilities, children that are somewhat disenfranchised or lacking resources of all sorts, including family and social support, financial resources, and so on. And as a corollary to other families that might find sort of benefit for and comfort from their child being able to seek MAiD, other families may be very opposed, and there may be pain and stress and suffering involved for families with the minor's decision. For healthcare practitioners, surveys have showed a greater unease about providing MAiD to minors generally. And it might actually have the opposite and not hoped for response, whereby potentially resources could be diverted away from pediatric palliative care or palliative care generally if there was a negatively altered perception that palliative care in some way could be associated with medical assistance in dying for youth. Potential safeguards that were thought of in terms of guiding further policy is it's possible we could state a minimum age, but, as previously stated, there is nothing to say that this is going to make things any easier or any more black and white. We could also, like some other countries, say that only specific medical criteria would apply to youth. And this has been done in Belgium and Netherlands, where the criteria for adolescents are different, and there is more scrutiny for minors, even though they are still eligible to receive medical assistance in dying. There's a thought that the multidisciplinary team that is already involved in the child's care should be the ones assessing the child's capability to make such a decision, just as the child's multidisciplinary health team now, in concert with the parents and the patients, are making the decisions of, where that child's capabilities lie in the great majority of cases. And the question of parental involvement in the decision-making process is a curious one, because we know from surveys, but also lots of informal conversations and work with focus groups, that parents want to be involved in this decision. And actually, in looking at to child and youth advocacy groups at different healthcare centers, the youth themselves actually want their siblings and their parents to be involved. And yet the common law would say that if the person is deemed to be a mature minor, they could actually make this decision apart from their family. And lastly, a potential safeguard could be having increased resources for palliative care, or some stipulation that a minor contemplating MAiD must receive palliative care consultation and services, which is not currently required for adults that are seeking MAiD. In practice, though, I think we're likely to receive more and more direct and indirect questions about MAiD for minors and their parents. And I think we need to feel ready to listen regardless of our own biases. I think one way we can do this is by, first of all, just being a little bit mentally prepared for the question and using neutral language in how we respond to these conversations. Suggestions, I think, are, first of all, to acknowledge suffering, both the patient's suffering, but also the patient's family, and to look for what some of the unmet needs might be in why is this question coming to light at all. I think it's really important that we don't judge. I think in general, far too much attention has been paid to what healthcare professionals think, and much less attention and firsthand experience has been considered from conversations with youth and parent advocacy groups. And I would look to many of the patient-centered care committees that happen at many children's hospitals across Canada. I think it's really important to avoid inflammatory language. Words like killing are not helpful to the conversation. And I think also we need to be real and to acknowledge the limits of palliative care. And so there is a huge difference to parents and youth, and I would say to adults. We can provide all the excellent palliative care in the world, but that's not going to answer all of the needs, and it's not going to preclude all suffering. And so, as one father said to me many years ago, I don't want her to suffer less, I want her not to suffer at all. And I think that's an important distinction. I know that what's a burning question on many administrators' minds is, do we need policies for MAiD at children's hospitals? I think that, it might be premature given how unlikely it is, or the low number of youth we expect to actually seek MAiD, to actually be embarking on formalized policies. But if your children's program does care for those over the age of 18 years, then they already are eligible, and you might want to think about what your approach would be, but knowing that they also would fall into the currently established adult programs. I think that the rarity of such a situation also suggests that we should really be collaborating with our adult partners, because they are the ones gaining the experience and the expertise. And I would refer you to an excellent article that received a lot of publicity, some of it not accurate, but by I'll try to say the name, Demichelis, then my colleague Brandy Zlotnick-Shull and Adam Rappaport at Sick Kids. And it's medical assistance in dying at a pediatric hospital. This came out just this January in the Journal of Medical Ethics. And I think it's one of the best, most thoughtful articles I've ever read about the issue of mature minors and that intersection with healthcare institutions and how we might consider the question both practically and philosophically and operationally. So I'm just going to stop it there and leave lots of time for not just questions, but also discussions, comments, and, you know, I know it's a really difficult topic, but I'm open to answering anything I can.
All right. Thank you very much. I mean, really a fantastic presentation. And as you said, a very difficult topic, but I think you did such a great job at sort of navigating some of the language and really showing us that a lot of the issues that I think people are concerned about have been discussed and included in the conversation, at least at some level. So we really appreciate sort of the breadth of the scope of this presentation that you've covered here. So as we said, this is your chance to ask any questions or provide any comments or anything. So just go ahead and type those into the question box. We do have a few here. The one question that came in was asking about the way it stands now. Is there any room for, you know, court challenges or like individual cases to go to courts to attempt to get MAiD for a minor, in the sense that it's not included in the legislation? So does that preclude them, or does that just mean it's a case by case where someone could go challenge to the courts, up to the Supreme Court even, to have a minor included?
Yeah, no, I think, and you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I must say I'm kind of learning little bits and pieces as I go. And I think, no, the legislation is the legislation, but appealing to the courts is absolutely within anybody's right to do if they could find a lawyer that they felt had a case, or I presume they could even, you know, start that process on their own. I think the interesting thing, though, is going to be the element of time. And for all the families that have raised this conversation with me, I think if the child has quite a short trajectory, there is no parent that has the time and energy to embark on a court challenge. So it would be interesting to see, you know, what parent actually would be able to commit the amount of time and energy required and would have a child with a long enough trajectory to go through the very slow moving process of a court challenge.
When you were going, we did have a question come in about the article that you just mentioned. If you want to just go back a slide, just so people could catch the name of that article again. Yeah, that one right there. Thank you.
I'll just move there now.
Yeah, so there was a question that came in earlier when you were sort of going through the criteria and what would potentially be required, and for the minor to communicate themselves their wishes.
Yeah.
Has there been discussion related to children with disability that have varying methods of communication that may or may not be well understood by people outside of the disability community? So the extent to which the person is able to communicate, being deemed competent, but still having challenges with communication, whether it be, you know, technology assisted communication, et cetera. Like, has there been discussion with respect to children with disabilities in that sense?
Yes, there was. And I think that the cornerstone of it will be that the person with whatever adaptive assistive technologies, that everybody that's party to the decision, and we could even leave MAiD off the table now, but for any healthcare decision, that there is sort of the ability to get informed consent that everybody's comfortable with. So we didn't go into it at a deeper level than that, but informed consent, you know, with all its challenges, would be possible as long as we are sort of enhancing that person's ability to communicate as best as possible.
All right. We did have a couple questions about, and they came in before you got to this point, and then you did subsequently start mention it a number of times around the issue of palliative care. We've certainly heard that at palliative care conferences, et cetera, that I've attended, where people talk about MAiD, and there's certainly frustration, whether you agree with MAiD or not. There's frustration with the lack of access to what they would consider proper palliative care across the country, particularly outside of major centers that have a children's hospital or a hospice like a Roger Neilson's house or that sort of service. So you I think there's some interest in sort of exploring that more and what the conversation around that has been as far as better palliative care before we get to this discussion, sort of the cart before the horse, discussing MAiD legislation before we have nationwide, proper palliative care for children. Can you give a little more sense to that?
That's such a critical question. And, I would say, unfortunately, the way that things have rolled out for adults in the legislation as that, adults are eligible for MAiD, whether or not they have been provided palliative care, whether or not they want palliative care. And so the law as it exists, that precedent is already there. And so to argue for why a child would be different, is going to require sort of a different conversation and a different legal approach potentially. But I think, the Council of Canadian Academies report that we produced had actually a very large section on the current evidence about palliative care for children in Canada and around the world. So I think, we did our best to draw attention to that point. And again, as someone obviously that believes very much in palliative care, I still foresee circumstances where, with the best palliative care in the world, it's not going to remove all requests. And, I think that if you look at some of the narrative from adults and from providers of MAiD to the adult population, many of those patients have received excellent palliative care and still wish to make a request for medical assistance in dying, whether or not they follow through with it.
A great point that we are learning so much from the adult community in that sense of, even like you said, with the provision of proper palliative care, there's still many that make the request for sure.
Right.
The next question that came in was asking, just in general, are there specific populations that you see MAiD being explored for the most? When you had your slide up from Belgium and the Netherlands, it seemed largely cancer-related issues. There was maybe muscular dystrophy I saw on there. But can you give us a sense of which populations are probably looking at this the most?
So it's a really interesting question, because from all those countries, first of all, what we were able to find is very minimal evidence. And so the missing piece is who is actually asking for medical assistance in dying, or where are the conversations happening? To this point, there have been no records of this. In Canada, though, I think one really beneficial thing is the reporting requirements that have been sort of enforced by law since last November, requires that for adults, physicians and nurse practitioners report all kind of consequences after a request for MAiD has been had. So whether or not the person goes on to receive MAiD, we will have then better information about who actually requested it, who died naturally without receiving it, who later withdrew their request, and those sorts of things. But that evidence is not available from other countries. And so in the case of mature minors, it has been just what I showed you, and I really don't have more to offer than that.
All right. The one question here came in sort of right near the end. It was asking, I think, just around your opinion on timelines, given the CCA findings, et cetera, and everything that you've shown. What do you see as the timelines for any changes to the legislation regarding mature minors?
Right. Well, the interesting thing is that, again, going back to sort of the preamble of the law, so basically palliative care needs to be reviewed nationally 5 years after Bill C-14 came into force. And that was now, this June, that's going to be 3 years already. So palliative care is going to need to be reviewed at that point. And forgive me, I can't remember to the letter of the preamble exactly when the law needs to be reviewed, but I think it was 3 years after those reports were tabled in Parliament, which would be sort of somewhere between June and November of 2021, say. I might have that a bit wrong, but in the foreseeable future, the other intervening things, though, is going to be a federal election, and whether or not there's a national appetite to have a discussion about this now or not remains to be seen. So my hunch is that the CCA reports were meant to foster further conversation among the Canadian public and policymakers, and so I'm thinking that probably it's going to all kind of come together around that 5-year mark after the law became actionable in 2016.
And this will be completely your opinion, but just given your involvement in this over the years, do you get a sense of how divisive this issue is? Is there two solid camps?
Yeah, I think I would say yes, but I also would say that this is how one person on the panel put it to me. First of all, I think that the panels worked really well, and to find people with all these diverse backgrounds looking at MAiD from all different issues, like from the point of view of regulators, clinicians, lawyers, judges, all these sorts of things. I think we kind of all got our hard edges softened a bit or rubbed off a bit. But I still think people probably believe what they've always believed, and these things are probably shaped from even early in our childhood for all kinds of reasons. So I think it is a very controversial issue. Not unlike abortion, and sort of the polarization goes down similar lines. But I think the evolving adult experience is helping the conversation, because I think that some of the things we really feared before it was a possibility in Canada, those fears might to a degree be alleviated as we hear from more MAiD providers that are speaking publicly, giving presentations such as this, and as we read narratives from clinicians and from family members who have really benefited from MAiD in their minds. And I would say as time goes on, just even personally, I have had now a number of relatives, the generation above me in my own sort of fairly close family, that have opted for MAiD. And, one of these people, actually, the day he died, was so thankful to Sue Rodriguez for paving the way. So I think that all of us very shortly, there have been at last report, the third report on MAiD in Canada, I believe, was last June. There was almost 4,000 recipients, and I'm sure many more since then. And everybody is going to know somebody shortly that has, taken this pathway. And so I think all of these things are going to shape our decisions, at least as far as the adult world goes. What remains to be seen is how the question plays out for mature minors.
All right. In all of the consultations and discussions that have happened to date, has there been any specific focus on Indigenous communities and their views on this?
And sorry, in 45 minutes, you can only just sort of touch on the edges. I think in general, one thing that the CCA expert panel did as a whole, so that was all of us coming together. Sometimes we met as a whole group, and sometimes we worked on our separate smaller panels. But we attempted to have Indigenous representation, both at a scholarly level, but also recognizing that we weren't doing public consultations. It became evident from the Indigenous scholars we were working with on the expert panel that the voice of elders and so on should be considered. So we actually had an elders circle in Toronto about a year ago, and recognizing that that is just one small snapshot of, those, I think, 6 persons that participated for that day. But I think in general, the Indigenous population feels, I would argue, like the rest of Canadians, that nobody was really consulted because it was as a result of a court case. But in any case, the Indigenous elders circle brought that forward, that they felt like there needed to be a lot more consultation. And then for some of us who have been trying to reach out to Indigenous communities, and I would say that just for myself, even when I was working in Alberta in trying to reach out to Indigenous communities, it seemed to me in my conversations with Indigenous patients and families themselves, as well as practitioners that worked with either inner city Indigenous communities or cared for Indigenous patients and families on reserve, that they just have so many other pressing issues that the issue of MAiD is not really high on their priority list, particularly for children. But the one important point I took away from all of this is that, and again, I don't want to generalize or stereotype, but a lot of what we heard from these elders is that, youth are sort of encouraged and expected to make their own way and their own discoveries in the world. And so I think that even with the court cases that had a lot of publicity that involved the parents' ability to make choices for their children based on their Aboriginal and Indigenous sort of nationhood and values and so on, that there is an acceptance that even fairly young minors might have a strong opinion and might really shape how their healthcare decisions are made. I don't know if I've represented that very well, but in 2 minutes, that's sort of the upshot.
Well, I think you said it very well, and particularly given that it is a very big conversation. And in 2 minutes, I think you did a great job of sort of capturing that conversation. I think that was excellent. The last question that we have here, and we, so if we do have about 5 minutes left. So if there's any last burning questions, please do type them in. This is the last one I have for now. So if there's no other questions after this, we're just going to go back to you, Dr. Davies, just for any closing messages or anything you'd like to leave the audience with, anything to look for coming up, any research projects or anything that are coming up in this area that you want to share. But the last question that I have right now is asking about if there's any thought that has been put to children under the care of, say, children's services, or who are guardians of the state, or children in the foster care system, et cetera, and whether would they have an unfair representation or support because their parent is constricted by potentially other laws or policies related to the foster care system or the child welfare system?
Yeah, I think we didn't discuss that in great depth, although we did definitely consider it. I think even in my practice as a pediatrician, and I'm just going to use the example of getting an advanced care directive to not resuscitate a child in care, even if they have like a completely known terminal illness. Sometimes that can be really challenging. So I think the issue of a child in care requesting medical assistance in dying, if there is any need for parental agreement or guardian agreement, I think that's going to be really challenging, because even accepting the reality of a child having a terminal illness in care is already a challenge to make sometimes appropriate decisions for that child.
All right. And with that, I think we do not have any other questions. So I think we'll wrap it up here. And just we'll just go back to you one last time for anything you'd like to close off the session with and leave the audience with before we sign off.
Well, I think, this sounds all very legal, and it's because we're talking about laws. But I think from my experience with youth themselves, I think it's going to be a really rare child, or I should say youth, that wants to embark on this kind of process, because the reality or the acceptance that they are actually dying often comes very late for youth. And I think that's reflected in the low numbers that we're seeing. I mean, there's many more youth that die of even cancer, as an example, than are asking for medical assistance and dying. And I think that's because they're just trying, and they're just desperate to live. So the notion that they might actually want assistance in dying is going to come to many very late in the process, that they're not going to be able to avail themselves of this. So just to kind of demedicalize or de-legalize the whole conversation, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, you did a great job of sort of keeping this to the facts and the legislation, and I think that's what we hoped for out of this presentation, and you certainly delivered. But you're absolutely right. There's a whole other conversation to have outside of that. But again, that's for another time. So thanks again for joining us. A great presentation. We had lots of comments thanking you in the question box. So certainly thanks again for such a great presentation.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
All right. So for everyone else, we do our webinars every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, and a couple of people asked in the question box about accessing this after the fact, and we do record all these sessions. Everyone registered here will get a link to the recording in a couple days once it's up on the Children's Healthcare Canada Knowledge Exchange Network, which you can also find at ken.children'shealthcarecanada.ca. And so the recordings are great, but when you do watch live, you do get to ask your questions and comments, which really do enrich the discussion. So both options are great, but when you can join us every Wednesday live, that's always the best. Next week on April 3rd, we'll be talking about better nights, better days for children with neurodevelopmental disorders. And we're going to be hearing from the Better Nights, Better Days team, which is a CHR research team led by Dr. Penny Corkum and Dr. Shelley Weiss. And they'll be talking about an upcoming study from their team related to sleep disorders or sleep difficulties in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. And they're going to be talking about an e-health intervention that that's been developed by a pan-Canadian team of pediatric sleep experts and experts in neurodevelopmental disorders. So a very interesting discussion. We've had them on our series a couple of years ago when they first started their work. So it's going to be great to hear what they've been up to in the last couple of years. So thanks again for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see everyone back here next week. Bye, everyone.